Alright, so I have the two contestants of tonight. In one tab, I'm going to have my Rocky VM, and in another tab, I'll have my Ubuntu VM. Right now, they're idle, they're not doing anything, and one seed that I see straight out of the bat is that my Ubuntu VM is using 11% RAM, while my Rocky VM is using slightly more RAM. But I'm going to run a few Ansible commands that are going to stress them out, and let's see who handles it better. I install W or K on both machines. And I'm going to generate a moderate concurrency load. On my Rocky VM, nothing really happened, but on my Ubuntu VM, the sysload spiked. Now the sysload on Ubuntu reached to almost 90%, and on my Rocky is under 40. Now my CPU on my Rocky is getting busy, more than in Ubuntu. This is over, they're starting to relax. Let's see who relaxes first. So on my Ubuntu, the sysload is currently at 30%. And on my Rocky, pretty much the same. The Rocky CPU is still busier than the Ubuntu one. Interesting that the graphs are similar. For some reason, it took my Rocky VM a minute to start spiking the CPU, as you can see. But both the spike and the relaxation were very similar on both machines. Something else that got my attention is that on my Ubuntu VM, the lowest point of my network traffic basic graph was 186 mega, and on my Rocky VM, the lowest point was on 1.5 gigabytes. Now they're back to normal, and again, I just wanted to say that Ubuntu uses less RAM and less disk than my Rocky VM. I'm going to perform my second test, an extreme concurrency load. CPU and sysload are raising fast on Rocky VM. Also on Ubuntu, slightly more CPU usage on Ubuntu, but Rocky is catching up. Rocky sysload reached to 85%, while my Ubuntu is at 95%, so Rocky is 10% lower on sysload, and my Ubuntu VM is using 10% of its RAM, while Rocky is using 13%. They're starting to relax. One thing that I noticed was that my Rocky memory was stable throughout this whole test, while my Ubuntu memory spiked at some point, and I cached and buffered a lot of RAM at some point. And on basic CPU usage, you can see that on my Ubuntu VM, the busy user part of the graph is slightly bigger. Well, it's almost twice as much as in my Rocky VM. My Rocky VM, the peak of the network traffic basic was around 1.48 gigabytes. And on my Ubuntu VM, the peak was 183 megabytes. This means that my Rocky machine is serving significantly more HTTP responses and transferring significantly more data. So I'll need to gather more context on that, but it seems that Rocky completed more HTTP requests, it sustained more active connections, and achieved a higher through output while maintaining CPU and RAM slightly similar to what Ubuntu was doing. In this case, in this isolated context, yes, I can say that Rocky Linux had a much better performance than Ubuntu in handling all of those requests. Now let's see how do they handle file system benchmarking. I'm gonna install FIO. I'm gonna perform a random write workload. See who handles it better, Ubuntu's ext4 or Rocky Linux XFS. I'm gonna expand this tab and I'm gonna go to IOPS. I can see that on my Rocky VM, the peak disk IOPS was on 22.9 IO per second, and the peak disk through output was 150. And on my Ubuntu VM, the peak IOPS was 44.5 IOs, roughly twice as much, right? Almost twice as much. Now, again, in this isolated test, we have a clear winner. Ubuntu likely completed roughly twice as much disk operations per second for that specific test. It can indicate a better file system performance, different caching behavior, lower storage latency, and different I/O scheduling behavior. I'll need more context to say Ubuntu is faster, but on this specific test, yes, it was much faster. It was twice as fast as Rocky VM. Now, let's see how do they compare on a random read workload. Sysload on Ubuntu is increasing, while on my Rocky Linux is slightly lower. Rocky is catching up on sysload, but still slightly less. Now, one thing interesting is that my Ubuntu peaked memory usage while my Rocky Linux VM cached and buffered a lot of memory, but it didn't actually peak usage of memory. The sysload on my Ubuntu VM is relaxing, while on Rocky Linux is still under heavy load. Okay, so I deleted the files. Now let's see which machine can compile a Linux kernel better. First of all, I'm gonna install the necessary tools. Now I'm gonna git clone the Linux kernel, and I'm gonna compile it. Let's see who does it better. On Ubuntu, my CPU is at 55, and on Rocky Linux is 53, roughly the same, sysload 63 and RAM 26. And on Ubuntu, the sysload is 65 and RAM is 20. I can still say that Rocky Linux is using much more RAM than Ubuntu in order to perform this task. So again, on this specific isolated test, I can say that Ubuntu can compile a Linux kernel in a more efficient way than Rocky Linux. I can say that my Ubuntu needs roughly 10% less RAM than Rocky Linux to perform the same task. Now, both machines absolutely peaked CPU and sysload, but my Rocky Linux VM is using 27% RAM, while my Ubuntu is on the same state for CPU and sysload, while using 17% RAM. So again, on this isolated test, I can say that Ubuntu is more efficient than Rocky Linux. Now, while this mess is happening, let's see who can handle a web server flood better. I'm gonna open another terminal, and while this task is still running, I'm gonna perform a web server flood. Now, on my Ubuntu VM on Network Traffic Basic, I can see that the peak is around 49, and on my Rocky VM, the peak is 389. Much higher on my Rocky Linux VM. So my Ubuntu VM is using 10% less RAM than Rocky Linux VM, but while both systems are under heavy CPU and sysload, Rocky Linux VM is able to transfer roughly 10 times more network traffic than Ubuntu. So in this not so isolated test, I can say that if my web server is under high stress, still Rocky Linux is gonna be much better than Ubuntu in transmitting network traffic, 10 times better to be exact. And that's it for today. That was the last test that I wanted to do. But in the end, choosing a distro comes to personal preference. Unless, of course, you want to serve a lot of traffic under pressure. In this case, Rocky Linux is your choice.